Well, some things never change in the world, do they? Well, let's not disappoint, shall we? In yesterday's Cardfight update, I talked about the announcement that next week we're going to have an update to the restriction list. And every time that we've got an announcement like this, there is widespread speculation in the community about what is going to happen in the next ban list, what's going to happen next week, next live stream, what is going to hit, which deck's gone, which decks might come back. And of course, this time around is no different, as in this video I want to go over my personal speculation and what I think is plausible that could happen, because honestly, I see one of three things, or maybe a combination of these three things happen. So let's begin by tackling these potential options of what's going to happen next week on November the 24th with this update. One possibility that might happen is that there's no update, that there's no new restriction, and also nothing is going to go off the current restriction list. The reason why this is a very possible outcome is because this ban list, or this restriction list, was a scheduled one. This isn't an emergency ban list that came out of nowhere like what happened, I believe, 2 months-ish ago with Luart and what happened earlier this year. This isn't the case. So there is a potential that just time run out, and they said there was going to be an update around this time, so they have to make the announcement that there is going to be an update, because they cannot just shove it backwards. They've never done this. So there is a possibility that nothing is going to be restricted. That said, there is also a possibility that there is going to be some changes, and that will lead us to the other two potential outcomes of next week's update to the restriction list. The second possibility is that there is going to be some restrictions added on top of the restriction list. And there are three main suspects that, in my eyes, are potential hit or hittable targets. One of those is Luart. Yes, Luart is still in the crossfire, in my opinion, because the deck is still kind of toxic of what it provides to the meta. I am very aware of what's happening in Japan right now with the latest introduction of VBT12, Divine Lightning Radiance, that Gurgwit is suddenly coming up, as well as some weird Gabriel lists are able to smash in some victories here there, and Vanquisher is also on the rise. But we haven't seen a lot of good results to actually see if this is going to change things up big enough to actually make Luart be pushed out of the meta. As every time that a new set comes out, we usually see an uptick in the usage of the clans of these new decks, because most players want to try those out for a couple of days or weeks, and that's pretty logical. But even in the sense that they might be good enough on par with Luart, it is still a fact that Luart single-handedly shut the power level up for the game, and every other deck now needs to meet it to actually make some kind of competitive splash. And that is something that I'm not really happy about and should maybe be dealt with. And what can happen is either we see a restriction of a certain amount of cards, or they might do some weird type of ban that's not possible to be used with Luart. Personally, what I think should be done to make Luart somewhat more playable yet be more restricted is remove the domain restriction. And this might sound weird, but they should alleviate the domain choice restriction with Luart. For one, that allows Luart to build in a different direction. But two, this is also maybe a good positive signal to the store owners in Japan that bought all the domains at a high price and then lost a lot of money the moment that they made the choice restriction, because the domain just tanked in Japan, and a lot of store owners lost a lot of money on that. By alleviating the choice restriction, there's a possibility that the price value of the domain will spike a bit, so the stores can at least sell them for a reasonable amount of price. Of course, removing that choice restriction, that would only make Luart stronger, because now they are at full power. That said, the moment they make that choice restriction gone, they should choice restrict, of course, Luart with Phantom Blaster Overlord or Phantom Blaster Dragon, so they still aren't able to utilize the Superior Right Chain. So effectively, it doesn't change a lot, but Luart now has access to the main, which still makes him stronger. And to then compensate that in a little bit, they should errata Luart. In the similar way that they just errated like Riviere to some extent, they change the skill tags. Because there are two things that I think should change on Luart's skill to make the deck a lot more fair, while also being able to run the main with it without suddenly breaking the deck. One is removing the ability to gain a force marker the moment that you ride back into the same Luard at the end of your turn. This is the exact same skill clause that we've seen on the new Vanquisher. So it's not something weird or new. They've done this and they can easily do that again and now put it on Luard. And for a second errata that I think shouldn't be in place with Luard, his stride skill or superior ride into the other Luard in Drag Driver should not cost 3 Counterblast, but probably 5 Counterblast to at least make that Counterblast cost mean something. That 3 Counterblast never comes up because you'll always have at least 3 grade 1s into the drop zone. By asking 5, you at least put pressure on the Luard player to swarm their field or their drop zone, so in order that they can get that for free. Otherwise, the opponent can actually do something with damage denying, because it's very likely that the Luard player needs to pay 1 Counterblast or 2 Counterblast on the first grade 3 turn if they didn't high roll. And with the added Nemain in the mix, there's at least some way that you can alleviate this increase of grade 1s because you now have access to Nemain. So I think a combination of removing the choice restriction with Nemain, but adding on the choice restriction with Phantom Blaster Dragon, which made a lot more sense, and at the same time, errataing Luard with the Counterblast 3 to Counterblast 5, and have the same wording that you cannot acquire a extra force marker at the end of the turn that we've seen with Vanquisher. That is what I think personally should be done with Luard to restrict it to some kind of sense and not immediately break the deck that it's not usable or whatever. That's my personal thing. Now for some more realistic restrictions, I think there's a highly likely chance that Gurgwit might get something on his name on this restriction list. And that's because just a power level of Gurgwit that it can compete with Luard and maybe even outperform Luard to some extent because of the whole defensive and offensive capability. And there are 2 possibilities that Bushiroad can take. They can choice restrict Gurgwit with Percival, but personally, I don't think that they are going to do this, because it's very obvious that Percival and Gurgwit were made the way that they are made because they were intended to work together. You cannot tell me that they didn't overlook the way that these cards work, that they thought they wouldn't be put together. They are so well made for each other that it's very obvious that they intended this interaction. What I do think that it might ban, or at least choice restrict, is still Wonder SL. That card allows Gurgwit to actually get extra free attacks that are still in the clause that they gain the extra power. And that might be an unfavored or an unwanted interaction that Bushiroad maybe overlooked and didn't thought would actually be used in the Gurgwit engine, and thus making the Gurgwit engine a lot stronger than they initially had foresaw. Now the third deck that might get a choice restriction, and this might sound weird or out of left field for some players, is Vanquisher. Vanquisher hasn't been really showing a lot of results in Japan right now, but the deck is unquestionably powerful. It's ridiculously how much multi-tech potential, power, and draw potential, while also harboring the control aspect of the binding playstyle the deck possesses. It's insane. And a lot has to do with the fact that most of their cards just are free of cost. They either cost no Counterblast or no Soul Blast, and they also gain advantage because you bind cards from hand and draw immediately back. But those cards you bind from hand aren't nagging yourself because those units are immediately called to the field, as they allow you to superior call. And then you also have Rising Phoenix potentially on top of that, which are even more free pluses, and you have a superior right Vanguard that stands so you can swing twice with your Vanguard, which inherently pluses you. And it didn't cost you Counterblast, and it didn't cost you Soul Blast. That's ridiculous how much pressure it can do without your opponent actually being able to play against it. Because damage denying doesn't really do as much against the engine because you don't really use a lot of Counterblast if you're playing Vanquisher. So there is definitely an argument to make that maybe Vanquisher should also get a restriction. And the restriction that I personally favor is a limit on Draggy Shot Dragoon, the old grade 3 support card for Vanquisher, because that's arguably one of the most powerful cards they have, because it has field control, it has multi-tech capabilities, it goes into the soul, it draws you a card, it sets a lot up while also opening the field so you can even call more superior call unit to the circles without needing to call on top of your own cards, thus gaining even more card advantage. And it being a grade 3 means it's also searchable with the grade 3 searcher, so it's even better than just a generic grade 2 or grade 1, which is pretty nuts if you think about it. So if they want to hit Vanquisher, I think limiting Draggy Shot Dragoon to 1 should be a very plausible option, as completely banning it is maybe a bit too much, but limited to 1 is a pretty nice way to at least damper the power potential of Vanquisher as a whole. But we have to see if they also do something about Gurgit or Luard, because maybe if they only do Vanquisher, it might be a bit too much, because it's still lower than what Gurgit and Luard are providing, at least that we see right now. It could completely shift at any time's notice when players start to catch on which of these 3 decks are actually top tier. And honestly, those are the only restrictions that I think are plausible for Standard. Now that brings us to the third and final point, and that is the potential of them actually unrestricting or unbanning cards that are already on the restriction list. Because it's possible that this restriction list update doesn't contain no changes, but also doesn't contain any new additions, but actually just remove some of the list, because that's also an option. And in this case, I think there are 3 candidates that might be unbanned or unrestricted to some choice. One of those being is the Silver Torn support grade 3 Dorian. I think that card could easily go to 2 copies or maybe even unlimited, at least in Standard, because Silver Torns don't really do anything in Standard, and even if they get Dorian, I don't really see them being anywhere as strong or oppressive as Luard can just do the same things, or at least way more, way faster. And then getting access to Dorian won't really affect them as much, especially since they already have 2 very good grade 3s, so they need to make room for all 3, while also now having a wide range of grade 2s and grade 1s, so their deck size is suddenly a lot more clustered, so it's not easy to say I'm going to splash 4 of this and then 4 of that, and which other am I going to remove a little bit. It makes the deck building a bit more interesting, as there are more options to explore. Now, also a possibility that it might do something about is Shiryuki. And I know, don't go overboard with the fact that, oh, Shiryuki at 4 is going to be nuts with Yasue. But keep in mind, we're going to get new Shiryuki support next year. So them having a Shiryuki limited at 1 is just weird. Because it depends on what this support is going to do. That means they're completely reliant on a new Shiryuki. And who knows, maybe that Shiryuki works with the old Shiryuki. So it makes sense for them at least putting the old Shiryuki at 2 copies if they want to go that route. But there is a chance they might put it at 3 or 4. They might also say that Shiryuki can be played at 4 as long as all your grade 3s are Shiryuki. They can maybe make that restriction. That's also a possibility. And that's mainly because of the potential of we're going to get a future Shiryuki card, as it makes more sense to not have the card banned. Now, as for the final card, and this might sound terrifying to others and maybe very happy for few, is some kind of alleviation of Anger Blader. And I'm not suggesting the card at 4. I think it is possible, a very small possibility, that they might put the card at 2. And I say might. I'm not suggesting they should, but it's a possibility, because we've seen that Gaia, it's kind of underwhelming in today's environment. And if they're going to keep Luard and Gurgit and Vanquisher at their uncontrolled power as they are, then it's really weird to me that why would they keep Anger Blader and Tachikaze's clan so much hampered down? As honestly, Anger Blader as a first turn Anger Blader in comparison to a first turn Gurgit or Luard or Vanquisher, it doesn't really sound that scary, honestly. It's basically the same, and maybe even weaker, because you need way more key pieces than those decks. So I definitely can see them unrestricting Anger Blader to some extent. Maybe not at 4, but at least at 2 is a very possibility. Now, that basically concludes my predictions for the upcoming restriction list, and I only talked about Standard because I have no clue what they would or should do for Premium. Like, that can be anything or also absolutely nothing. In Premium, it's a fair game for anybody in that sense. Now, those were my restrictions for the upcoming restriction list of November the 24th, aka next Tuesday. So let me know in the comments down below what you guys think is possible to be on the restriction list during next week's live stream, as there is definitely a lot to talk about and a lot to discuss, as there are some arguments to make for different cards to either be on the restriction list or be put off of the restriction list. So let me know, as always, all your thoughts in the comments section down below. This video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/fingeredinsider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/fingeredinsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one!